going to be talking about democratic failure. And this is something that I've talked about with you from the beginning of class. We know that the period that we're living in now has been characterized first and foremost by reversals of democracy and by democratic backsliding. In fact, the world has become less democratic over the last 10 years. And in fact, we're even thinking about and considering whether we're in a third wave of de-democratization. And so the topic of democratic failure matters, not just because democracy is at stake, but also because it's happening now, and it's something that we should understand in a critical way so that we can be engaged global citizens. Before we get started, I think that I think actually everything is pretty clear. I don't know if we need to do any housekeeping. Let me just go ahead and get things going here, and we can get started with our lecture. I think I'm going to grab Bernie because I felt a little bit better with him. I hope that's okay with you. Give me just a second. Hang out with me. Okay. Now, the way we defined democratic failure is it's a period of democratization followed by stagnation and then the stabilization of authoritarian rule. This is basically when countries democratize and then revert to dictatorship. It's a process that takes place over a period of years because obviously a country has to transition to democracy and then return to authoritarian rule, which suggests that there's kind of this pendulum or this kind of balancing act or this kind of movement back and forth between two poles. Now, democratic failure is really important because obviously the period that we're living in is characterized above all by democratic failure. I've told you already earlier in the course that between 2009 and 19, the rate of democratic failure increased to 18%. That was almost twice the rate of democratic failure of previous decades. In particular, the period between 76 and 1986, and then the period between 1987 and 2007, rates of democratic failure were as low as 11%. And so we know that one way of measuring regime survival is taking a look at the failure rate of different regimes. And we already saw, for instance, that increases in the failure rate of, say, military regimes during exogenous shocks seems to indicate the fragility of that regime type. In the same way, the increase in the failure rate of democracies seemed to suggest the fragility of democracy as a regime type. And so this is the world as we find ourselves in. And it's a world where not only are democracies failing, but the popular discussion is very much about democratic failure. This is one of the best-selling books in recent years. It's by Stephen Levitsky and Ziblatt, I think. I'm forgetting the other one. But it's called How Democracies Die, and it's about the abuses of executives and how submissive parties enable abusive executives to basically undo democratic institutions and erode democratic institutions. This is the nature of democratic failure, this stagnation of democracy and then this return to authoritarian rule. Now, we know that since 2011, in particular, there have been many new democratic failures, and there's been an increase, moreover. And these include countries from everywhere in the globe, not just African countries like Senegal, but also European countries like Hungary, Bangladesh, Thailand, Turkey, the Philippines, Venezuela, Guatemala, Nicaragua. These are all examples of democracies that have failed. And the case of Hungary is a particularly jarring case because this is an example of a country that previously was a very stable democracy. Since 1990, Hungary was a very competitive electoral and political system that was robust to a lot of these same kinds of erosion. But since about 2018 and the rise of the Viktor Orban government and its supermajority, the system has become far less democratic and has collapsed entirely. And so that not only has been an affront to the European Union, but it's also meant the decline of independent media in Hungary. And so we'll take a look later on in today's class at the case of Hungary, and we'll use it as an example of democratic decline. And we'll talk in particular about how it shows the excesses of executives in this contemporary period. Now, democratic failure is sort of the umbrella term that relates to the failure and then stagnation and then return to authoritarian rule of some democratic regimes. But failure itself can actually occur through different types of reversion. And backsliding is really one that we'll focus on today, and really the focus for us in this class. So backsliding is increasingly the way that democracies fail. And it is essentially a reversion to authoritarian rule carried out by democratically elected incumbents themselves. And as we'll establish, this is really new, because we know that for many, many decades, democracies failed because the military would seize power and there'd be a violent coup and they'd burn the palace down, as they did in 1973 in Chile. Or there was some violent military intervention from abroad and there was this imposition of an authoritarian regime, as in some Latin American countries and Central American countries. But increasingly, it's the elected governments themselves that carry out these sort of reversions from democratic rule, and they do so by undermining and destroying the institutions of democracy. And they do this in a piecemeal way that involves disintegration and step-by-step dismantling of systems that are supposed to support democratic politics. One example that we'll discuss later in today's lecture is, of course, Recep Erdogan, the former prime minister and current president of Turkey. I say former because under his control, Turkey transformed from a parliamentary system to a presidential system, because it would concentrate more power in his hands. And the concentration of power in Erdogan's hands in Turkey has meant the undermining of a lot of democratic institutions and really the collapse of democracy in some ways in Turkey. And so this process of state-led destruction is a process that characterizes the current climate and that characterizes democratic failure as we know it today. Now, there are some ways for us to look at this. We can look, for example, at the pattern of classic coups d'etats. This is where the military seizes control, ousts the existing government, and then installs an authoritarian ruler. This is not the way that democracies fail. This is simply increasingly a sort of part of the past. And this is best represented by the pattern that we see where, especially in the late 50s and in early 60s, military coups and coup attempts were quite numerous. But as early as the 90s and really the early 2000s, coups began to decline really sharply, and they kind of stabilized at a very low level of frequency, and they just don't happen. And moreover, the ones that do happen are largely unsuccessful. We see that some are successful, but this might be reflecting the fact that only those that are certain to succeed are those that are tried. But generally speaking, there are very few coup attempts and very few successful coups. And so classic coups d'etats, this is not how democracies fail. They increasingly fail through other means. But the other means also don't include executive coups. This was something that was more common to the 1980s and 1990s as well. This is where the executive just comes out and dissolves other institutions of government. And so the key example is Peru in 1992, where Alberto Fujimori dissolved the Congress and declared an auto coup, as he called it. This was an example of an executive coup in that it was very blatant and very obvious and self-evident. But an executive coup is a lot like a military coup in that it's very obvious and self-evident and easy to criticize, and it doesn't at all warrant legitimacy, and it's not viewed as a legitimate means of concentrating authority. And so these also are on the decline. Executive coups just don't happen as much anymore. It was in the 90s when they became more common, where in addition to Peru, they occurred in Armenia in 1995, Belarus in 95, Zambia in 96, Haiti in 1999. But only one country, Niger, experienced an executive coup between 2000 and 2013. So this is telling because it means that the nature of democratic failure is changing, because we know that during that period, democracies did not stop failing. They continued failing. And in fact, the period beginning in 2011 in particular saw a spike in the number of democratic failures. And so if executive coups were not happening, but democratic failures were, we know that executive coups were not at the heart or at the root of the problem. There's also another form of democratic failure that's also on decline and helps us to understand the new nature of democratic failure. And the decline of election day voter fraud is what we're talking about. It's no longer the case that executives just steal elections. Now, this once was more common, especially in the 1990s, when early on it was considered palatable to have democratic institutions, but where incumbents in governments and strong figures could abuse the electoral process to their advantage. But increasingly, especially since the mid-2000s, it's very, very difficult to steal elections. And the reason is obvious. There are very, very negative consequences in terms of international sanctions, in terms of how it might affect the country's membership in international organizations, and so on and so forth. And so not only does this affect those things, but you can't legitimate a stolen election, right? Everyone knows it's stolen. And so like a military coup and like an executive coup, election day vote fraud cannot be legitimated. We cannot, say in good faith that this is an upstanding or an acceptable or a valid way of taking power or maintaining power. It simply isn't. So there is a decline in classic coups. There is a decline in executive coups. There's also a decline in election day vote fraud. But the forms of backsliding that remain unchanged or are on the rise relate closely to the activities and the actions of the incumbent government and those freely and fairly elected governments who are already in power in what they're doing to erode democratic institutions from the inside. And in particular, there are two forms of democratic backsliding that fall under this umbrella. And those forms are promissory coups and executive aggrandizement. Now, what we're going to do is I'm going to discuss these types of failure, and then I'm going to give you examples, recent examples. And then what we're going to do is we're going to have a more comprehensive discussion where for several minutes or even a large portion of the class, we'll address some of the core underlying questions and issues that arise, and we'll really try to engage with this and with the patterns that we see. Now, this is not a duplication of what we discussed at the beginning of the class. This is a setup for what we'll do on Wednesday, where we begin to analyze democratic failure. And we introduce 3 different models, and we'll test them and examine them and take a look at some data. Today, we're setting things up. We're getting the field ready for Wednesday. And so we're getting the concepts straight. We're discussing the types of failure. We're discussing the ways that regimes fail, how it looks in practice, and then we'll talk about some examples, and then we'll have an engaging discussion where we talk about whether democracy itself is on the decline or if we're just witnessing slow progress. We'll talk about what kinds of activities characterize a transition from democracy to authoritarian rule. Talk about some other things as well. And so let me talk about promissory coups and give you some examples to help to illustrate this. So coups are no longer coups of the kind that we know and recognize. Military coups are a thing of the past. Militaries still do seize power. It's just that they're not doing it, for the purpose of installing a dictator. They're not doing it for the purpose of putting themselves in charge. They're doing it increasingly as a means of framing the ouster of an elected government as a defense of democratic legality and making a public promise to hold elections and restore democracy as soon as possible. So this is kind of like a military coup without the military getting involved in politics or sort of expressly getting involved in politics or sort of putting itself in charge or so on and so forth. But there's a serious catch here, because what I'll show you and what I'll suggest is that these promissory coups don't actually typically quickly give way to democratic elections. In fact, in most cases, democratic elections, if they take place much later, years later in some cases. And often the military will remain in power, or an interim leader installed by the military will remain in power. And for all intents and purposes, it's an authoritarian regime during that period, and the coup looks much like a military coup would. But the point is that these types of coups are framed differently. They're framed as a needed step towards a better democratic order, towards a more democratic order. And so the military is not seizing power to do bad and do evil. It's seizing power to correct the limitations of democracy as it was understood and practiced previously in that given country. Now, what's really interesting is that the share of successful promissory coups has risen from 35% before 1990 to 85% afterwards. And so almost all of the successful promissory coups have come since 1990. That suggests that the situation has changed considerably, and the reasons that promissory coups are being carried out often will relate to this new context since the 1990s, this more global context where there's a real value on appearing to be at least formally legitimate, or at least on the surface willing and engaged in defending democracy. But the truth is that these are not defenses of democracy. They are more often, like I said, just military coups dressed up in sheep's clothing. And so let's take the example of Thailand. In 2014, there was a political crisis in Thailand. And Yingluck Shinawatra, the prime minister at the time, was thrown from power by the military in a coup. And she was detained for several hours at a military barracks, 2 hours outside of the capital. And eventually, if I'm not mistaken, either exiled or forced into, essentially cover within the country. And the military did this, promising to hold elections and return power to a democratic government. What they said was that it's necessary to cleanse the system and clean up and then give power to a democratically elected government, one that is not corrupt, like Yingluck Shinawatra, the prime minister, who was enmeshed in a corruption allegation, and who was being charged with corruption by other political actors. Now, the long story short is that was in 2014, and in 2018, the military was still in power, and they still had not held elections, and the same general, Prayut Chan-o-cha, was still in power. That was the general who took power in 2014 and who became the spokesperson for the military. Now, elections were finally held in 2019, a full 5 years later, but guess what? Chan-o-cha won. And so not only were the elections 5 years late, but the elections were not competitive elections. They were elections that tilted the playing field in favor of the party created by Chan-o-cha to represent the military and others. And if I'm not mistaken, there were certain restrictions placed on the opposition that made it virtually impossible to contest the incumbent government. And so this is a promissory coup. It's one that sort of begins based on the promise of democratic elections and a return to democratic rule, but usually ultimately gives way to the collapse of democracy and the rise of military rule. So here's a headline from June 2014. This is right about when the coup took place. And right away, Chan-o-cha came out and said, democracy will return, but only after reforms are put in place. But those reforms, he said, will come by October 2015. They promised elections by 2015. Did those elections happen? No, they did not. That is consistent with what we expect. The promissory coups don't typically lead to quick elections because that's not the real point. The point is to legitimate that coup and to present that coup as a more acceptable and palatable option, especially in the eyes of the international community and anyone else who is in a position to judge Thailand. Now, the second form of democratic backsliding is executive aggrandizement. And this is an abuse of power that occurs when executives weaken checks on executive power. And this is above all characterized by a process of sort of internal erosion. Executives carry out assaults on institutions of government that we normally take as self-evident and we value for their own sake. Those institutions include the courts and the judiciary, prosecutors, legislatures, the media, oversight and regulatory agencies, electoral bodies. The way it works is these incumbents destroy these institutions. They gut their budgets. They reform them structurally by restricting the number of compartments or offices or departments they have, or downsizing them. They put their own stalwarts in charge. They limit their powers or rewrite their mandate. They compromise their independence. They abuse them. They deny them resources. They, in general, try to complicate their functions so that they don't work to threaten the incumbent government's hold on power. Of course, the most important part is that this occurs through legal channels. This is, by definition, a legal process. It's a legal facade in the sense that what's taking place does undermine democracy, but it's legal. And so these include, for instance, constitutional assemblies or referenda, the different legal channels through which these changes can take place. Oftentimes, a new constituent assembly will be inaugurated through a constituent assembly elections called by a president who wants to rewrite a constitution in their favor. Referenda, which can also be called by presidents, including in Latin America, can also be used to legitimate or kind of legalize these actions. Courts can also be stacked or packed or compromised in ways that lend themselves to legitimating or propping up or kind of rendering decisions that prop up this kind of process of institutional destruction carried out by the executive. And then legislatures where the executive supporters form the majority. So in that book, How Democracies Die, one of the things that Levitsky and Ziblatt point out is that it takes a village. Executives might want to destroy these institutions, but they can't do it alone. They normally need a party in Congress who can pass laws that can help to push this process. And so there's a role then for the parties in the legislature who support the executive. This is another way to kind of legitimate and kind of create a mandate for these kinds of abuses. So one of the examples that we know from class, and really the canonical example of executive aggrandizement, is the example of Hungary. And it's worth going over this example again because of just how far Hungary has fallen. Hungary was a stable democracy since 1990. And in fact, it was one of the best examples of liberalization and democratic consolidation in post-Soviet Eastern Europe. It was looked at as a sure case of democratic consolidation going into the future. Very few people thought it was at risk. In 2010, the situation began to change when the Fidesz government, led by Prime Minister Viktor Orban, came to power. They did a lot of things very quickly. They used their supermajority to tilt the playing field. They packed the Constitutional Court. They limited opposition media access by politicizing state media, co-opting private media. And they used gerrymandering to lock in legislative control. And they've done all of this in short order. And what we have today in Hungary is a system that is a shadow of its former self in terms of the checks and balances and sources of horizontal accountability that previously existed. The courts are no longer independent. The legislature is stacked in favor of Orban. And in general, this system has been set up to consolidate power for Orban and his party. This is an example of executive aggrandizement. Let's watch a video. Before we watch the video, let me take a look at the chat. Arturo says, sounds like what the current executive administration is doing. Yeah, what's interesting is that a lot of what we see in this list and in this presentation seems to have some relevance in the US case, without a doubt. And we can talk, for example, about court packing. We can talk about gerrymandering. We can talk about suppressing the vote. We can talk about invalidating or discrediting the electoral process. We can talk about abusing state resources, like using the White House to, put on the Republican convention. That's illegal, and so on and so forth. We could talk about a lot of different examples. The US, as we've talked about, is sort of a case that is vulnerable to this kind of backsliding, but where the backsliding itself isn't quite to the degree that it is in some of these other cases. Nevertheless, the US is obviously a case that we should look at closely, because this has a lot of relevance, what we're discussing here, for the US. So let's watch a video about the case of Hungary. This is interesting because it shows us why it matters that these democracies fail, and what these authoritarian governments that fill the void use their power to do once they are able to come to power. So we'll watch this Vice video and then we'll get back together. Oh no, hold on. Where's the audio? Hello. All right, everyone, I need to find the link online. The video is not working. The audio is not working. Just a moment. Okay, so let me pause the share, and then let me also pause the recording so that YouTube does not take down my video. Now, the rest of the story in Hungary is oh, just a second. Hold on. Okay. The rest of the story in Hungary is a little disturbing. In March 2020, just this year, the Hungarian parliament, which was controlled by the Fidesz party, which again had gerrymandered the districts to lock in control, voted and approved a law that gives Orban the power to rule by decree indefinitely. And so this is essentially the complete concentration of power in the hands of Orban. And it's done through legal channels. It's done through the parliament, and a parliament under the control of Orban's party. I'm forgetting the name of his party, but it's the Fidesz government. And so Fidesz is the party. This is the situation in Hungary. This is an example of executive aggrandizement, the concentration of power in the hands of the executive through democratic means, and really the destruction of democracy through democracy. So it's kind of like dismantling democracy democratically, if you will. Now, there are other cases that aren't as clear cut. And one example is the example of Turkey. Now, if you go back to Turkey in 2015, you would call it, a functioning democracy, but one that seems to be troublingly under the influence of a very powerful prime minister who'd been in power since 2003, and that is Recep Erdogan. But the situation since 2015 has deteriorated dramatically. So basically what's happened in Turkey is there's sort of been a similar concentration of power. It's been through a referendum transforming Turkey into a presidential system. It previously was a parliamentary system that gave the parliament the power to issue no confidence motions, gave the parliament power to remove the prime minister. The transformation of the system into a presidential system takes away that power. It also gave Erdogan the power to appoint judges, an unlimited number of vice presidents, and more troublingly, rule by decree has also been streamlined and has become quite common, especially since 2016, when there was a failed military coup that gave rise to this movement to consolidate power in Erdogan's hands in the first place. But the reason that I put a question mark about whether this is a case of democratic failure is because although democratic institutions have been involved in carrying out these changes, the changes to date don't completely dismantle democracy. There still is a functioning Congress. There still is a set of checks and balances. It's just that the Congress, the former parliament, has been weakened considerably, and substantial decree making authority has been vested in the president, who is the head of this new presidential system. And so whether Turkey is an example of democratic failure or not is kind of up for debate. Some people say that it's a full-blown authoritarian regime. Some people say it's a hybrid regime. I think it's probably somewhere in between those two poles. It's not clear to me that it's fully authoritarian, and it's not clear to me that it's fully hybrid either, because of the consolidation of power in the way that it took place democratically. Now, democratic failure is something that we've talked about, and we've looked at the numbers, and we've looked at the change in the rate of democratic failure over time. But what's really interesting is that democratic failure and backsliding are also visible in the data sets that we use in this course. And so the one that I want to draw your attention to is POLI 4. Now remember that POLI 4 goes through 2008, and really we have data from about the 1980s. If I'm not mistaken, maybe it goes back further, but the numbers that I want to give you relate to the period between 1980 and 93 and the period between 1994 and 2008. Between 1980 and 1993, there were 10 reversions. Between 1994 and 2008, there were 17. Now, the difference reflects an increase in backsliding. That number 17 during that latter period, 9 of those stemmed from backsliding. And backsliding in particular in the form of promissory coups and executive aggrandizement. And these forms of backsliding, again, are very different than, say, the military coups and the executive coups and the election day vote fraud that characterized previous periods. So notice that basically between about 1994 and 2008, you see the most significant increase in the number of reversions per year. And then you see the largest single increase in 2006, 2007, when we go all the way up to 3 a year, both years. In previous years, in the early 90s, it was 2 a year. In previous years, going back to the 80s, it was always 1 per year. And so we see an obvious increase in the rate of backsliding. This is evident in POLI 4 as well. If you were to use the Democracy Dictatorship Index, the number of failures appears to be more uniform across the periods. The reason is because democracy dictatorship is better at teasing out military coups, and less sensitive to some of these executive abuses and some of these forms of backsliding that are internal to the regime. Okay, so this brings us to the most important set of questions of all. And I'd like us to kind of sit back right now. I gave you a presentation. It lasted about 40 minutes, and we discussed forms of democratic failure, specifically forms of backsliding. And we talked about what goes into backsliding and the nature of backsliding. We talked about the techniques of transformation. We also talked about general patterns and trends. And I'd like to address 3 questions. The first question that I want to address is, what kinds of actions transform a regime from a democracy to a dictatorship? Let's address this question and think as broadly as we can. Now, you don't need to be thinking about the specific types of actions most common today. There are a lot of different kinds of actions that could end a democratic regime. But I do want to have a discussion that includes them all. And so as we have this discussion and as I hear from you, I'm going to be writing down what we come up with. And I'm going to keep a list so that we can discuss it and keep a tally as we go along. And so let's get started. We can use the chat, but I'd also like to use the mic as well. What kinds of actions transform a regime from a democracy to a dictatorship?
Well, the ones we've gone over are court packing, neutering institutions that are used as guardrails for democracy, and abuse of executive power.
Can you think of like a type of abuse of executive power?
Executive decrees and or referenda in the case of Erdogan.
Yeah, that's a good example. Like abusing presidential powers to bypass institutions or like appeal directly to voters in a way that is legal and would give like the president like a mandate to maybe undo some of the institutions that hold up the democracy. Absolutely. So Ishan starts us off with three good ones: court packing. He sort of mentions institutional destruction. I think we can think of different like types of that, but that's definitely on point. And then also decrees and referenda. You know, using decree power, using referendums to bypass like the legislature and to try to appeal to voters and to kind of do so in a way that would create like an electoral mandate sort of for the president. What are some other types of actions that we can list besides these three? Doesn't have to be the president, by the way. It can be any actor who might end a democracy. What else? Yeah, Tyler, military coups certainly count. And, you know, I gave you that data that showed that there are fewer and fewer military coups and fewer successful ones. Um, the truth is that they do still happen, and they mainly happen in Africa. And the reason that they happen in Africa is because it doesn't take a lot to stage a military coup. All you've got to do is round up a couple military units of dissatisfied soldiers, get some other generals together who might agree with you, get control of some tanks, take over the presidential palace, detain the president, and then gain control of like, you know, the media or like the state media company or something. And that's all you really have to do when the state is relatively unsophisticated. In African countries, with some exceptions, much of the state apparatuses, if you will, are less sophisticated, and so it's usually easier to take over in that way. But to be clear, in a country like South Africa or Botswana, it's very difficult. Those are relatively consolidated democracies. But in a country like, say, the Democratic Republic of Congo, or a country like that, or maybe Namibia. These are the kinds of countries that are very small. The states are relatively unsophisticated. Military coups still happen in those places. It's just that they're less successful often, and they don't happen as often in other regions of the world. Happened in Thailand, obviously, happened in Central America and Honduras in 2011, 2009, excuse me. But it doesn't happen as much in those places anymore. So we've got court packing, institutional destruction, decrees and referenda, military coups. What else? What about the media? Well, I'm happy to be in calling on people if you guys don't want to participate. I'll give you a moment or so more to become a little bit more engaged, but we can sit here in silence, or I can call on people, but this is a discussion that we should have, and at some point I expect you to engage. So try as hard as you can to reflect on what we just discussed. There was reading for this week as well. Hi, Jose. Do you have a comment?
Yeah, I was trying to say that, as you mentioned before in class, not only will the authoritarians seek to destroy the media or control it, but it'll either undermine it to such degree that it will no longer have an effect on people, or be completely under its control, as you had mentioned. Another thing an authoritarian state could do to how do I say it, demonstrate its power would be abusing them. Well, not abusing, but how do I put it? Buying the media. Well, not buying it.
Co-opting the media.
There we go. That's the term.
But you're right, it is buying. You're pretty much correct. The media is important, and this is key because the media is what's either involved in exposing the wrongdoing of government or supporting and validating and legitimating government. And in authoritarian states like China, for instance, the media is totally under state control. And the reason is because the state, the authoritarian regime, the party in particular, wants to control the message and wants to use information to legitimate the regime, because that's key. And so wannabe authoritarians or would-be authoritarians are the same way. They abuse the media, they discredit the media, they try to bring violence upon the media. And more directly, they undermine the media by doing things like sometimes they expropriate or nationalize the media. Sometimes they deny opposition media access to the same resources. They'll deny the opposition access to the media. And in general, they try to use the media as an instrument or as a mouthpiece, so to speak. And this becomes really critical when the media is really, really functional and useful as a counterweight to the government. So where the media really, really works well, would-be authoritarians have to work extra hard to try to abuse it or discredit it or eliminate it. And so co-opting the media by purchasing it, as Joel said, or undermining the media by maybe expropriating the media or nationalizing the media, like what happened in Venezuela, that's also very common. And so in Venezuela, over a course of several years, the Socialist Party basically nationalized all of the private media. And what happens when that happens is that the new state media conglomerate is just completely a mouthpiece for the regime. And this is one way that democracies fail. So Louis says, could you say how a country reacts to certain threats? So I think that there are certainly actions that come about in response to certain threats or certain circumstances. Maybe if what you mean is to say that, like, well, what about like a global economic crisis? Does that create circumstances that can be exploited? Well, maybe. It could be that during an economic crisis, all regimes are more likely to fail. This is true. We know this to be true. We saw this last week with both the Geddes reading as well as the presentation I gave you. Economic crisis causes all regimes to fail more readily. But to address this question, what we should say is that, well, economic crisis creates an opportunity for certain kinds of actions that might help to bring down a democracy. So like maybe economic crisis creates a pretext for a military coup. Maybe it creates a pretext for like a referendum to reform political institutions to concentrate power in the hands of the executive, who might claim that the crisis is due to something political that can be changed. The actions that would maybe become relevant in a context of crisis or a certain circumstance or a threat, those actions could include undemocratic actions, to be sure, Lewis. Elaine says the media can also influence people's views in the way things are currently running. Without a doubt, the media really has a lot of power. You know, it was once said to me, and I'll never forget the way it was said, a student once said, you know, we only know what the media chooses to report. And I think that's just a stinging indictment of the power that the media has structurally, right? They're the ones who either can expose or can conceal that wrongdoing. They're the ones who can either legitimate or can delegitimate the government. And whether they do those things and which side they fall on can depend a lot on the way the regime and the way the government relates to the media and what they do to either co-opt them or undermine them, or nationalize them or eliminate them, or so on and so forth. Tyler says, I believe you mentioned that media can be altered and transformed to appeal to the incumbent supporters. That's exactly right. Arturo says the media can be co-opted, for example, Fox News. It is not even real news, as they do not have a license to actually report news. They are classified as an entertainment source, yet people rely on them as actual news. So Arturo, interesting point. My question for you is, who co-opted Fox News? And if co-optation is something done by authoritarians and those seeking to consolidate power, who are the sort of stakeholders, and who is it that sort of has Fox News working for them, so to speak? Tyler says gerrymandering can be used to pack the so-called minorities to silence them and gain majority control in Congress. We see this a lot in cities in the US. Yes, Tyler. So in both Hungary and in the United States, both packing and cracking are used to consolidate or break up minority voters, so as to make them weaker as a whole. And so gerrymandering is obviously super important, because when you tilt the playing field, part of the way you do that is by counting the votes differently, right? And by ordering and grouping people differently so that they're less powerful as a bloc. Julissa Renteria says, I think the media plays a big role in what keeps the democracy strong or distorts it. I think that social media, the media in general, makes it easier for people to have more of a voice, to organize causes like protests, hold politicians and leaders accountable for their actions, spread news that the news does not cover, etc. So a lack of this would likely lead to dictatorship, or if media outlets are in the hands of the wrong people, like dictators who distort what actually happens. Yeah, Julissa, absolutely. Who's in control of the media, right? Like in whose hands does the media fall? I like the way you put that. And they obviously have interests that kind of contradict the public interest. And so, you know, what happens can really affect the regime. Elaine adds, like, yes, a lot of bias can be displayed on media outlets. So this is really excellent. So we came up with a number of comments, and before we go on, Tyler adds a few. Some other factors we may include are extreme political polarization, economic and racial inequality, and voter suppression. So Tyler, what actions do those things give rise to? Do those circumstances create desperate people who then behave in a certain way that might compromise democracy? I certainly agree that those are important. I'm wondering what kinds of behavior do those things motivate? Oh yeah, Arturo. I don't know exactly who either. Arturo answered our question regarding who holds the puppet strings and who controls the Fox News, and we're not really sure. Arturo says this is a good question. I don't know who the puppet master is, but it does seem that they definitely benefit the Republican Party. It does seem that way. Yes, UL, voter suppression would count as a transformative way to slowly decline a democracy. Yes, it would, because every act of voter suppression has a legal mandate, right? So, like, you know, a decision by the Congress to discontinue or cut off counting of ballots at a certain date, or the decision of certain state governments to restrict access to polling places, maybe the decisions of the Supreme Court to limit the counting of ballots that are mail-in ballots or are ballots that have been discredited by an incumbent government. You know, these are all examples of voter suppression that would count as legal means of undermining democracy, without a doubt, to the extent that voting is a process that democracy depends on. UL says it's easier for troops to vote by mail, but people of color are asked for voter ID in specific places and other barriers. And not to mention the fact that it's well known that heavily minority districts have far fewer polling places proportionally than, more conservative and whiter districts. And let's not kid ourselves. That's intentional. Tyler says, I feel like it motivates excessive executive power as well as creating rage from the constituents in those countries. Certainly, Tyler, if it's true that executives fear staying in power when inequality is higher, if they do, they might be likely to erode the institutions of democracy so as to try to remain in power, for sure. So we've got a list here. We've got court packing, institutional destruction, like defunding certain institutions or certain agencies, decree power, military coups, referenda, undermining the media, co-opting the media. These are all actions that can help to transform a regime from a democracy to a dictatorship. These are all examples of different types of actions that would bring about that outcome. Now, the question, which techniques of transformation are most common today? This is a question that deals more with the pattern that we see since the early 2000s and the late 1990s. And the types of transformation that we see increasingly, as we have already established, relate to those more legal means of change, those legal processes or those democratic ways of undermining a democracy or transitioning to authoritarian rule. Those include, for instance, voter suppression, court packing. They include using decrees and referenda. They include various ways of abusing the media. The most common techniques today are those techniques that can be validated or be legitimated, right? That can be held up and pointed to as acceptable in the eyes of international organizations or other states or other countries. So that means military coups are not acceptable, but things like court packing, things like using your legislative majority to gerrymander districts, using your legislative control to create supermajority requirements, using your legislative control to get unlimited decree power. These are all examples of contemporary techniques of transformation. And this is the nature of the contemporary transformation that we've talked about already in the class, this way that democracy erodes under legal facade. And I want to really emphasize this. The reason that a legal facade is necessary is because the costs of de-democratization are higher than ever. And so this is important to point out. Even though democracy is increasingly under threat, the costs of transitioning to authoritarian rule have also never been higher. So what that means then is those would-be dictators have to find ways of doing it democratically. They've got to find ways of doing it legitimately, doing so in a valid way, in a way that can be viewed as acceptable by voters and by others. And so we end up with these legal means of internal decay, this kind of internal destruction of democratic institutions. The question that I want us to address now, and that we'll spend about 10 minutes discussing, is this third one. This is a question that we can address and answer in different ways, and it depends on your point of view and really whether you're kind of an optimist or a pessimist. And the question is, do trends in backsliding reflect democracy's slow progress or its total demise? Do you think that this means that democracy is getting stronger, or that democracy is in decline permanently? What do you think these trends really mean sort of in the big picture?
I think it's just an example of, I guess, wannabe authoritarians innovating ways to find out what is deemed internationally acceptable and what isn't. For a long time prior to the 1990s in this current era, backsliding wasn't common because other types of democratic failure were. Those previous types were deemed internationally unacceptable, and therefore we saw the decrease of those. whereas the rise of the more uh, today's democratic backsliding. So I think it's more an example of how a democracy is naturally imperfect and how difficult it is to maintain a democracy anyways, because democracy is effectively just an eternal experiment.
Yeah, so maybe it's kind of interesting. On the one hand, it's like, yeah, this backsliding has led to like the collapse of some of these democracies, but the nature of the backsliding itself is different. As you point out, Ishan, it's no longer like a military coup that leads to these changes. It's more like, this process of internal decay. And maybe in that regard, we should view this as a win or as like a success, right? We're not dealing with military coups anymore. We're not dealing with executive coups. We're not dealing with vote fraud. We're dealing with, these scoundrels who have to very cleverly undermine the democracy because they can't get away with it otherwise. That seems like a win. That seems like progress. That seems like progress, even in the midst of decline. Now, maybe you would say along this line of reasoning that if military coups were as common as ever, and possibly even more common, and if democracies were failing at the greatest rate ever, maybe then we would say that democracy appears to be in decline because the means of democratic decline have not changed and the pace of democratic decline has quickened. And so I want you to be careful and nuanced in the way that we assess this, because it's possible that the precise nature of the new democratic backsliding should give us some pause and some cause for optimism. But I want to hear from more of you. What do you think? Do these trends reflect slow progress or demise? What do you think?
Professor, as you had mentioned earlier in the semester, not only are we not in a reverse wave of democratization, but I mean we are not experiencing it. But even though it may appear this way, democracy is slowly but surely treading forward. As you had mentioned, and as you have shown us through statistics and data, democracy is surely progressing. I mean, from a pessimistic perspective, it does look like democracy is failing, and these coups are taking over the weaker democracies. But if we take into account how many countries are at the same time transforming themselves into a democracy, let's say Venezuela, for example, it's fighting its own little war within itself to democratize or go back to authoritarian. And then we have Chile on the other hand, which is slowly transitioning into a more democratic nation. I would like to believe that democracy is slow, but even though it's slow, it's working.
Yeah, Jose, you made some really good points. And it's true that at the beginning of the semester, we pointed out, we did an analysis. We determined that we're not really in a third wave of de-democratization. We're close, but it hasn't really began yet. And the reason that's important is because there have been prior reverse waves. And this isn't quite a reverse wave. And because it's not quite a reverse wave, and because the nature of the backsliding is so sort of democratic in itself, it seems that on the whole, democracy is surviving, in that there's sort of this kind of linear progress that's interrupted by these fits and starts and this kind of fraying that happens occasionally. But on the whole, there appears to be a movement forward. And I think that that's a fair assessment, right? Maybe if that third reverse wave of democratization really begins, maybe if there are like 4 or 5 more failures in the next 5 years, maybe then we begin to talk about demise. Maybe then we begin to talk about a substantial shift. But the nature of the backsliding and the fact that we still haven't quite reached a critical mass as far as the number of reversals suggests that maybe we're still moving forward. Arturo says, if I may, I think that some coups have positioned themselves as being a savior from God. They put themselves as divine right rulers, but they are not kings or queens. Can it be said that religion has been used in some way to further backsliding? Well, the first example that I think of, Arturo, is the example of Thailand, where the monarchy doesn't have a religious component, but the power of the monarch traditionally in Thailand was viewed as omnipotent, right, and as all encompassing. And the military has traditionally been very aligned with the king in Thailand, and some say that the coup in 2014 was a reflection of the king's support for the coup. And from this point of view, you might be able to argue that there's some sort of like pseudo-religious like dimension to it, in that that sort of legitimacy and the validity of the king conferred on the military this kind of like divine right to intercede, like to intervene. It's also worth noting that in that case in Thailand in 2014, the court also basically sanctioned the arrest of Shinawatra. And in addition to the arrest, the sort of ouster of Shinawatra, the prime minister then, Yingluck Shinawatra. So there was kind of a spiritual component, but that was because of the relationship between the king, the traditional monarch, and the military in Thailand. But that's the example I think of when you mention that. Yuel says these backsliding trends imply they're dichotomous governments, right? Perhaps democracy is just high maintenance, albeit democracy is imperfect. It requires a lot of keeping an eye out. Earlier in the semester, the class thought democracy was declining, but fast forwarding, Bolivia and Chile had their own positive outcome in their own way. It's a slow process. Yeah, Yuel, it's a good point. The first point that Yuel makes, which is really important, is that, look, are we thinking about democracy as dichotomous? Are we distinguishing between democracy and dictatorship? Are there just these two poles? Because maybe it's just the case that democracy is a lot of work, right? Maybe it just takes a lot of maintenance, and you've got to deal with stuff and repair things. And maybe it's difficult to keep your head above water when you're a new democracy, and it's possible that you'll encounter some challenges, or that you'll have to deal with some legacies from the past. And then Yoel also adds that, the record in Latin America is more mixed because, for example, Bolivia seems to have moved firmly back in the direction of democracy after an interim government, which was unelected and for all intents and purposes authoritarian. And Chile is becoming more democratic than ever, with a popularly demanded and written constitution. So, it depends. It depends where we look, and it depends on the where we are in that process. And I think that one really important point that comes from this discussion is that democratization is not a linear process. It's a slow process that's characterized by fits and starts, and by half starts, and by all sorts of challenges that can't be anticipated, but that might threaten temporarily the future of the regime and the survival of the regime. But really, that's the same thing that we can say of authoritarian rule. So from this perspective, democracy is just another type of regime, and all regimes are subject to backsliding, democracy included. What I would be interested in seeing is, what is the failure rate for democracies relative to the failure rate for different types of authoritarian regime? And we have that data in the Geddes piece. And I apologize for not thinking of this question beforehand so that we can compare, but I'll point out to you that the failure rate for democracies since 2011, 18%, is higher than the failure rate for some one-party regimes during some periods in time. Now, the failure rate for military regimes was higher than that for democracies, but the point that I'll make is that there's similarities and differences between democracy and different types of authoritarian rule, and these regimes may survive or perish depending upon different factors. And so maybe we should loosen up and expect less survival from democracy and treat it more as a regime type that's amenable to change, and that might change. And then more generally, all regimes develop in ways that are nonlinear. There are fits and starts, there are half starts, and there are challenges. And so from this perspective, and taking into consideration the nature of the new democratic backsliding and the fact that we've yet to enter a third reverse wave, from this perspective, we might have reason to be optimistic that democracy is making slow progress, and that at the very least, democracy will and may return again someday. And so this is, I think, where we can end for today. We technically have a minute left, but we don't have more time to discuss these things. Thank you everyone for being here. I'm going to stop the recording and you're free to go. I'll see you on Wednesday.